Good evening.
It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the hospitality you've already extended. Forgive me for sitting down. I work in prisons in Uganda and Kenya where officially prisoners aren't meant to sit on chairs. So when we get together, if anyone's on the floor, we're all on the floor. And prisons are an environment where power is used in many ways. And I think as we learn from you, as we learn from St. Benedict, we wonder what it looks like to recognize our shared humanity, even as a group of people with very different roles and backgrounds. As I've been speaking to some of you over the last few minutes, it seems that Worth Abbey plays a role in many of your lives. And it was Father Martin at Worth who suggested that I come and meet with you. It's a special place for me too. I first visited about 5 years ago when I'd been working in prisons in Uganda and Kenya for about 10 years. I realised that I'd lost my peace. I'd become a bit bitter and frustrated and burnt out. My default position was to act and to try and serve, and often to be busy in doing so, but not really to invest time in stillness and silence and wondering what it looks like to serve, looking at Jesus' example of love and journeying with those on the edge of society, but balancing contemplation and action. And as I look to this Wellspring community, I'm fascinated to understand from you what that looks like. It's been exciting reading about the ways that you're bringing hope and serving in and around Brighton, but also sharing life together and sharing meals and having a shared spiritual life. I started the African Prisons Project when I was 21, having first visited a prison in Uganda when I was 18. I'm part of a group of prisoners and prison officers and lawyers and legal academics who wonder what it looks like to live in a society where poor and rich are treated equally in the hands of the law. We wonder what it looks like to put the power of the law into the hands of the poor. We wonder what it looks like to follow Jesus' example of moving to the margins of society and saying to those that others have rejected that you're loved, that your life has matter, and you're worthy of justice. And over the next 25 minutes or so, I know we started a bit late, I hope that'll be all right. I want to share some of the reflections on sharing life with others and what the glimpses I've seen of community on this journey over the past years with you, hoping it'll give you some food for thought, and also you'll have suggestions and reflections for us. I grew up in London. Since I was a little boy, I'd wanted to be a barrister, lawyer that appears in court. I was intrigued by the idea that one person's words could affect another's freedom. I was deeply moved from an early age by the death penalty and the idea that to show that it was wrong to kill, the state could kill. I came from a family that hadn't been to university. My dad came to the UK from Jamaica in the 1960s. We didn't have very much money, but I had my heart set on going to Oxford. The government here used to pay for poor but bright children to go to fee-paying schools under an assisted play scheme, and I got one of those places. So I was doing well at school and wondering what it would look like to go to Oxford, study geography. I was intrigued by the world and I found people fascinating, and then to study law afterwards. I thought if I'm going to get in, I need to have some volunteer experience to strengthen my application form. So I started volunteering at a hospice in London from when I was 16. Found the experience of journeying with the patients and their families as the patients came to the end of their lives, deeply rewarding and eye-opening. In my first few weeks there, I met a 19-year-old girl who was dying of a brain tumour, and her whole head was covered in bandages as she was approaching death. And it reminded me that none of us can take life for granted. I think sometimes when we're young, I'm 33 now, we can almost have a sense that life is owed to us, or that we have many decades ahead of us. And sometimes there's a risk that we put off until tomorrow what we might do today. I read in the Saturday Telegraph magazine about a hospice in Uganda established by a former Benedictine nun who's a doctor who's been working in Africa since 1960, Dr. Anne. And they look after people dying in their homes around Kampala, Uganda's capital. I'd never been to Africa, but the work of Hospice Africa sounded fascinating. I wrote asking if I could go and visit after my GCSEs. They said I was too young. So I did my A-levels, applied to Oxford. They said I couldn't think laterally and rejected me. I thought if not Oxford, nowhere. I'll take a year off and I'll reapply at that time to Cambridge, and they rejected me too in due course. But I had this gap year on my hands. I didn't know what to do. The hospice in Uganda said now I was 18, they'd have me. Initially I decided to go for 2 weeks. My mum said I was throwing my life away for nothing, that I'd get ill or have a car accident, and I did get malaria, and I had a few motorbike accidents, and the day I left she got shingles because of her fear. I initially spent a month with the hospice doctors and nurses going on home visits as they looked after people dying at home. It was fascinating. These people who were dying in very simple circumstances often extended huge hospitality and welcome and kindness to me. Sometimes my contribution would be to say a prayer for them. I didn't feel I was being very useful. One day we went to Malago, Uganda's national referral hospital, where the hospice was taking morphine to a dying man. We went onto this man's ward, and the hospice doctors and nurses went to see their patient. I saw this man lying on the floor by the toilet. He was naked, lying on a plastic sheet. I said to a nurse, what's the situation? Well, the police found him unconscious in a market. We think he is diabetic and in a diabetic coma. We don't know his name. We don't know if he has any family, and we're waiting for him to die. I understood because he didn't have relatives. He didn't get washed, or any medicine, or any food, or anything to drink. He was lying in this pool of wee, semi-comatose, and the flesh on his bottom and back was rotten, so you could see his bones. I went and spoke to Dr. Anne about him, and she said, with someone like that, even if he's going to die, he can die when he feels cared about. One of the things Dr. Anne taught me is we're never too old to serve. She's 84 and still involved in establishing hospices around Africa. Sometimes we think I'm too young or too old or not qualified enough or too qualified or anything else. But she reminded me and challenged me that all of us can serve. So I went back to the hospital the next day and bought a basin and towel and soap, and found a nurse trained by the hospice to help me. We tied bandages around our noses because this guy was decomposing whilst he was still alive. He really stank. And we washed him and got him some clothes and some bedding. I tried to get the doctors to treat him. For 5 days I washed him and tried to advocate for him. Came on the 6th day and he died the night before. He was lying dead and naked on the floor. After a while a porter came with a trolley with a dead woman on it and put the man on top of the woman and said they're going to mass grave together with everyone else who had no one to bury them. And it was really a turning point in my life, because I think in this country we have a sense that everyone's life has some basic value. But now I saw that there are people who live and die like dogs, whose lives are judged to have no value by their community. And it was somewhat counter to my understanding as a Christian. I was baptised when I was 16 of Jesus' example of living a life of love, and the idea that everyone is my brother and sister. So I spent 3 months on that ward, which was for people with AIDS and tuberculosis who had been abandoned by their families, washing them and feeding them and advocating for them before they died. I saw that it was a real privilege to journey with people approaching death, and that there was a sense of satisfaction in being able to offer something then, but also a chance to learn something. And this group of security guards from the hospice I was staying at, and gardeners, and cleaners and student nurses came alongside me, and we started washing and feeding and caring for these abandoned people together. It taught me that there can be joy in doing very difficult work as part of community, and that sometimes the world tells us that we need more GCSEs or A-levels or degrees or masters or job titles. But I think Pope Benedict said, as Christians who want to serve others, we should have some competence, but we should have, our hearts should be formed. I saw that for people who saw the humanity in those that were dying or rejected, they could serve with great compassion and love, despite the fact that they might not be highly qualified. There I met prisoners, usually teenage boys, about the same age as me, in prison for having underage sex. It's one of the most common offences in Uganda and has a maximum penalty of death. I thought that these boys could die of starvation or dehydration whilst they're in hospital because the doctors and nurses would chum them. I think about one called Peter Kamia, who was 21. He had cancer and AIDS and Norwegian scabies, which makes all your skin peel off. I found him outside the hospital ward. They didn't want him to be on the ward with other patients. I wheeled him in and started washing him. This group of American missionaries started going around the ward praying for patients. And other patients had their families and bedding, and they were provided for. This chap had nothing, but they left the ward without praying for him. I called them back and I said, I can't understand why you prayed for everyone else who was well provided for. Look at this chap. He's got nothing. All his skin's peeling off. And they prayed for him. I said, well, what can you do to help? Because look, he's in a pretty bad situation. They said, our pastor said we can only pray. And it challenged me to wonder what it looks like in very difficult circumstances to serve in a way that we want to be served, and believing that there's power in prayer and that God moves through it. But as St. Teresa of Avila said, Christ has no hands but ours, no hands or feet on earth but ours. That ours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on the world. And I think this planted seeds in me of what it looks like to bring together a group of people that is serving on the margins of society. Through meeting prisoners there, I bulldozed my way into Uganda's maximum security prison and went to death row. Built for 50, it had 500 people, including people sentenced to death for treason and mutiny and cowardice, or someone who'd stolen a mango from a neighbour's mango tree. They'd used a penknife to steal it. So because they'd stolen a mango and they'd used a knife, they were armed robbers, had to be sentenced to death. After that, I went into the prison hospital. As I went in, an 18-year-old boy died. The place stank, the windows were smashed. Said it hadn't been painted since the 1950s. I thought regardless of what this boy had or hadn't done to be in prison, and then 2/3 of prisoners in Uganda hadn't had a trial. Worked side by side with me, prisoners and prison officers together, to create an environment that they were proud of. And it started to get me thinking that in unexpected places, there are people with gifts and talents. Or one of the people I work alongside now, who's been in prison, she's been on death row for many years, said, we find treasure in trash. And I think those that society says don't have value, have gifts and talents and tremendous potential which God has given them, but sometimes we don't see. I wonder what it looks like to harness it and to be transformed as we journey with those that others have rejected. So I went off to Nottingham University to study law, and then spent my university holidays in prisons in Uganda and Kenya and Sierra Leone, establishing libraries and clinics, thinking that decent infrastructure would make prisoners feel better about themselves. Started the African Prisons Project when I was 21 as a Nottingham University Student Society, and at 22 registered as a UK charity. I think for me there's a sense that in our teens and in our early 20s I had, and I think for many of you, we can have a strong sense of our values and our convictions. We feel we need to respond to them, but sometimes we don't exactly how. And I started the African Prisons Project as a means of getting fellow students involved in this work. But people around me said, well, aren't you wasting your time? You should focus on your studies. My dad said, from then till now, you need to knock this madness on the head and get a career. Or early on, as I started this organisation, I worked night shift in this hospice in London. He said, you don't need any O-levels to wipe people's bums. And sometimes we can have a sense of conviction or calling, and other people can try and pull us off course. It was difficult to find people to support us. They said, why bother with prisoners? And I don't know if any of you have visited prison or have spent time in prison or come across prisoners. If so, you're welcome. I'm reminded very often, and recently when I visited the Teze community to give a talk there, I met those who've been in prison, others who've been victims of really serious crimes, that we're all broken and beautiful people, that we have gifts and talents and potential, but none of us is good. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says that if we look at someone else's sin, we think that somehow it's much worse than our own. We're not really mindful of what sin is at all. Saw that in prisons around Africa there were tremendous needs. I spent time in about 130 of them in about 15 countries. I went to Juba Women's Prison in South Sudan. As the gate was opened, I saw a woman with chains on her arms and legs. I said, why is she chained up? I said, well, we chain up our lunatics and those who are going to be executed. Although South Sudan's one of the world's youngest countries, it's still hanging people. So what's going to happen to this woman here? They said, well, with her and a number of the other women, she's not done anything wrong. Her husband was accused of a capital crime, but because the police couldn't catch him, the wife was arrested and sentenced to die in his place. Australian prison officer working with the United Nations in South Sudan's prisons told me of a 5-year-old child swimming a river with a 3-year-old friend, and the 3-year-old drowned, and the 5-year-old was arrested and sentenced to death for murder. So I spent time in prisons around Africa, and I saw that they were filled with people who weren't, on the whole, vicious or unrelatable or wicked, but they were poor. In almost all cases, they didn't meet lawyers. Sometimes I see them coming out of the police station with their fingernails pulled out, or in a coma because the police had beaten them until they'd broken their skull or damaged their brain. They go into prisons where prison cells the size of this room. In some prisons I visited in Zambia might have 90 or 100 people living in it, and half of them would stand for half the night, another half would sit in the med swap. People would lie together like sardines. In some African prisons, inmates have died from suffocation. So I saw that there were huge needs which others didn't necessarily want to respond to. And in countries with many NGOs, few seem to be working in prisons. It got me wondering what it looks like to serve in difficult areas where there are huge challenges which can be overwhelming, and whether that's a reason to shy away. My mum said, why don't you just serve orphans? That'd be much easier and people would understand it much more if you did, rather than trying to explain why her son's working with prisoners in Africa. But I saw the needs were great. I started to have a small team of staff, some lawyers and librarians and teachers who go into prison to do adult literacy classes and mother and baby reading groups. But the needs were huge. And so with time, we said we can't bring all the experts we need to in the prisons we work in. We recognised we didn't need to because there were gifted people in prison. When I first went to death row in Uganda, I saw on the stairs going up to the gallows where inmates were executed, a geography O-level class taking place, and an inmate was teaching his peers. I saw prison officers who earned maybe £100 a month buying sanitary towels for women prisoners who'd otherwise not have them. I saw some prison officers coming on their days off to do Bible studies, inmates leading the prison football team. It reminded me that there are gifted and talented people in unexpected places, and that God can use all of us. And I looked at the Bible and I saw how again and again God used, often in very powerful ways, people who'd sometimes committed very serious crimes. I think about Paul's background as effectively a terrorist, but God used him. I saw that prison could be like a refiner's fire. It can destroy a sense of agency or self-worth, but it can also build courage and compassion and boldness. I wondered, how do we tap into this? So last year, after almost 10 years thinking about making prisons better, establishing libraries and clinics, we thought, in fact, how do we work to get people out of them in countries where there's huge injustice? And recognising around the world, it tends to be wealthy people who become lawyers and poor people who become prisoners. Some prisoners would say, I sold everything I had, gave my money to the lawyer took it, and wasn't seen again. I wonder what would it look like for those who know what it means to be raped in the police station, or to have their fingernails pulled out by the police, or to be in prison for years without trial, to have legal knowledge. So this is what our focus is now. We wonder what it looks like to build a community of prisoners and prison officers and lawyers and legal academics and allies who together study law and practice law and move to the margins of society to bring justice to those that are rejected. So we're around 250 people working in just under 40 prisons in Uganda and Kenya. About 60 of us are studying for University of London law degrees by correspondence from those prisons, following in Nelson Mandela's footsteps. We had our first student get a first-class mark this summer Our students perform much better than the university's average. They have a hunger for legal knowledge. And others are trained as basic paralegals over a 2 or 3 or 4 week course. In the prisons we work in, we establish legal clinics where we work on people's cases for free, prisoners and prison officers doing that work. In 2018, each month we've seen about 250 people released from prisons in Uganda and Kenya, having access to legal services from those we've trained and then gone to court and been given their freedom. We wonder what it looks like from prison to work to change laws. So our first woman to study law with the University of London, she's called Susan Chigula. She was sentenced to death in Uganda when she was 21. From death row she started a school. She was a leader in many areas of prison life. We got her admitted to the University of London to study by distance learning from her prison in 2012. She was one of their best students in human rights law. She established an informal legal aid clinic in her prison, and she led a case. Her name is Susan Chigula. The case is Susan Chigula and 417 others against the Republic of Uganda, which got the mandatory death sentence overturned. Formerly, if you were guilty of murder or armed robbery, you had to be sentenced to death. Now judges never had to give the death penalty, but sometimes they choose to. And Susan and hundreds of others were released from death row, and she graduated with her University of London law degree in March of this year as a free woman. Our first male student to graduate, Moses, started as a prisoner, studied for his law degree, worked on his appeal, got his conviction overturned, and now he works as a prosecutor in the Ugandan army. There are no defence lawyers there, but he knows what it looks like to be wrongly prosecuted. So we wonder what it looks like for the last to be first, for those that the world has rejected, to have access to quality education, which allows them to be involved in serving others and doing justice while in prison and upon release. We wonder what it looks like to study and practice law in a way that prefers the poor. We wonder why it tends to be the case that wealthy people can afford legal services, but poorer people tend to be the ones who are more often in conflict with the law, whether in Africa or in the UK. I'm just like this because I'm a magistrate here, a lay and minor part-time judge, but I send people to prison here. And I wonder why is it the case in this country too that often we're seeing people coming to court without lawyers. And whilst we're dealing with an offence they've committed, often their life is full of complexity and pain, and rather than punishment, what they need is love. So we wonder what it looks like to go out as agents of love. As a community of reconciliation, a group of people that are hated by many, people say, so you're training people who've stolen and killed and raped and tortured and been innocently imprisoned and sentenced to death in law. So we believe that God can use all of us. We wonder how we grow in love for each other and for God and for those we serve. We wonder what it looks like to form our hearts, because I'm sure that those of you who are involved in this community's service work know it can be difficult stepping into other people's pain. When we have challenges of our own and then we come alongside someone who's in the midst of difficulty. I think about women I was with at Thika prison outside of Nairobi in Kenya recently. In a cell about this size there were 73 women. In another about the size of this carpet there were 14 women with maybe 5 or 6 children. Some of the women were pregnant, the children were up to 5 years old. We've got women there who are working as paralegals on their peers' cases. I said to them, how often do you cry? Because every day we're asking you to step into other people's pain. And these are women who are often in prison for bizarre reasons. One was in prison for rape, but you've got to have a penis to rape. So she didn't know why she was there. She has no lawyer. I guess the police don't know either. One woman said, we don't have husbands supporting us. We have to go out and work to support our children. It's hard work. We can't take our children with us. She said I was... it's a nice song. To move to the margins of society and how we form our hearts to do so. Oscar Wilde said, the challenge with prison isn't that it breaks hearts, and hearts are made to be broken, but rather it turns our hearts to stone. I think sometimes as we share our lives with those in the midst of difficulty, there's a chance that we can get a bit immune to their challenges and to our own, and we close off. Well, for most of my 20s I stopped crying. So I think during my teenage years and early 20s I saw so much which I just had no idea how to process. And sometimes I do it through drinking or smoking, all sorts of undevelopmental things. So I felt I was following my calling, but actually I wasn't equipped and didn't have the people around me who could support me on that journey. And so as prisoners and ex-prisoners and prison officers and lawyers, we share meals as you do here. We have Sunday lunches in prison together. We spend time doing Lectio and Divina together. We've had maybe 6 sessions in the last year of Teze worship in prison. All of us on the floor without our shoes, whether the head of the prison or a death row inmate or a lawyer or anyone else, sharing in this, these moments of quiet and contemplation and prayer. Even God can encounter all of us regardless of what we've done, regardless of what shame we're carrying, regardless of what others have said about us. I'm wondering what it looks like to be a prophetic witness. It's a group of people who are in some ways despised or living somewhat on the edge of society, but saying it's possible for us to love in ways that we hadn't imagined. It's possible for people who aren't meant to get on to come together and to serve together. And if it's possible for these changes to happen in prisons in Africa with huge challenges, what does it look like in the difficult, challenging parts of our lives or the community around us? I think my time's about up. There are maybe 1 or 2 quotes that I wanted to share with you. One's from a chap called Shane Claiborne, who's involved in the Simple Way community, who wrote a book called The Irresistible Revolution. I don't know if any of you have read it, but their example of journeying with those on the margin of society and being transformed by each other was very inspirational to me. And he said, Christianity can be built around isolating ourselves from evildoers and sinners, creating a community of religious piety and moral purity. That's the Christianity I grew up with. Christianity can also be built around joining with the broken sinners and evildoers of our world, crying out to God, groaning for grace. That's the Christianity I've fallen in love with. I think that I'm reminded as I spend time with those on death row, and as we look to our future, we're invited to take our model into refugee camps. Wondering what it would look like in London to invite homeless people and prostitutes and asylum seekers to come to some of the law firms we work with and to study law there, recognising just because their lives don't look ordered doesn't mean that they're not gifted with much potential. Maybe they have some resilience and grit, which means they can use the law in powerful ways. And as we wonder what it looks like, what the future looks like for us as a group, how we respond to the invitations we get from around Africa and beyond to go and serve in different places, that it's impossible. As much as we've grown and we started with no money, our budget this year is about £1.5 million, to try and be attentive to what God's saying to us and to make time to be still and to hear him and to try and discern his will in the midst of opportunities and busyness. And there's a quote from Viktor Frankl that says, being human, he was imprisoned by the Nazis in World War II in a concentration camp. He said, being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. Aspire for those on the margins, as you see homeless people around here, or people in the midst of difficulty, rather than just feeling pity, wonder what gifts and talents and great potential and beauty they have to offer to you and to those around. Father Martin at Worth Abbey shared this prayer from a nun called Sister Odette, who was killed in Algeria in the late 90s, and it speaks very powerfully to me. He said, live today's day. God gives it to you. It belongs to you. Live it in him. Tomorrow's day belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you. Do not impose today's worry upon tomorrow. Tomorrow belongs to God. Hand it over to him. The present moment is a frail footbridge. If you weigh it down with yesterday's regrets, tomorrow's anxiety, the footbridge gives way and you lose your footing. The past, God forgives it. The future, God gives it. I think I've learnt as I've journeyed with people in prison or on death row that sometimes it's easy for me to be caught up with what's next in a week's time, a month's time, a year's time, and to miss out on the fact that this is the time that we have, and to try and understand what it looks like to be present to myself and to those around me and to God. And finally, I leave you with this Franciscan blessing. It's kind of a manifesto for us as an organisation or a community, or I'm not sure quite how to describe us, but every time I'm in prison I share it with those that I'm working alongside. May God bless you with discomfort and easy answers, half-truths and superficial relationships, so that you can live deep within your hearts. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger and war, so that you may reach out your hands to comfort them and to turn their pain to joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, that you can do that which others say cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor. Amen.
Amen.